Dream Psychology, Chapter 11, The Control of Interest. Conditions may arise in the psyche in which interest is held up abnormally. The will strives in vain to direct it along a particular path, and the cause of failure is not manifest in the conscious mind. The following case may serve to illustrate this state of affairs. The conscious estimate of the patient R of his condition requires to be studied before the problem of his dreams can be taken up. It can be condensed in the following terms. He had a strong impulse to perform a certain task, but as soon as he began it, a check occurred. His interest would not flow along the desired channels. His ideas weakened and faded, and he fell into a kind of reverie state or mental blackness. The sense of a loss of confidence in his intellectual powers grew on him. He became absent-minded, apathetic, and irritable, and eventually wondered if some brain deterioration had set in. He could not give up the task. The impulse to attempt it remained, but the results of these attempts became increasingly unsatisfactory. 4 salient points can be selected from this brief account. Number 1, the impulse continued in the patient R all through his troubles. Number 2, although the impulse was there, adequate control of attention and interest failed him. 3, when the patient began to work with obedience to his impulse, his conscious field became a blank. What had existed in it rapidly faded. Number 4, he had no explanation of the cause of his state, save that it was due to some obscure physical condition. I do not propose to enter more fully upon a discussion of the conscious estimate of R, because the features essential to initial estimate of the significance of his dreams have been compressed into the above account. But it is worth pointing out, perhaps, that the state of mind R found himself in, though not rare as a temporary experience, is one that might possibly have caused serious mischief if it had persisted. A persistent impulse strongly felt but incapable of adequate realization or comprehension, that is, incapable of being led out into the light, might suggest something akin to a compulsion neurosis, which is one of the most troublesome to deal with amongst the psychoneuroses. Broadly speaking, a compulsion neurosis is an imperative impulse behind an irrational or antisocial idea. It is a kind of abnormal fixation of interest, but in this case there was nothing necessarily irrational or antisocial in the impulse, which did not play through any particular circumscribed area of conscious ideas, but remained as an indefinite irritant in the marginal psyche. During the period of his trouble, he experienced unusual, vivid dreams. I propose to record and discuss 3 of these, in the order in which they occurred. Number 1, quote, I was in an upper room surrounded by a crowd of ancient philosophers in flowing robes. Amongst them I saw B. They were all talking at once, with pompous gestures. In the center of the room was my writing table, and at it sat someone whom I did not see clearly, as his head was in his hands. I gathered that the noise around him interfered with his work. When I Then I found myself in the room below. It was a dirty kitchen. A fat, ugly cook with bloodshot eyes, as ugly as Socrates, came in. She was friendly and demanded a drink of beer and stout. I had some beer in a bottle. Excuse me. I had some beer in a bottle in my hand, but I could not find any stout. I became embarrassed. At last, I found some on a shelf amongst the dirty crockery. I poured her out a mixture, and she took it, fixing me all the time with a humorous, leering look. Then she nodded and winked and raised the glass and said quite distinctly, "You must always mix the clear with the muddy," and began to drink. At that moment, the floor above us collapsed, and there was a mix-up. But I was not hurt. I caught a glimpse of one very tall, empty room. The cook and the philosophers had all vanished. End of quote. This dream forms a good example of the semi-rational atmosphere in which the dream conceptions of the sleeping mind are cast. It is well constructed, but apparently quite absurd. We may assume that it contains marginal or unconscious material, that is, material inadequately realized or not realized by the dreamer. If the above dream is carefully examined as it stands, there are some interesting points to be found in it. The dream opens with the dreamer standing in the upper room among a throng of ancient philosophers, and there he sees his own writing table at which sits a shadowy figure who is prevented from working by the noise around him. The anamnesis, ANAMNESIS, has already told us that the patient himself, so soon as he sits down to write, is overtaken by a mental condition that prevents him from continuing. On his descent from the upper room, when the dreamer finds himself in the lower room, he has in his hand a bottle of beer. Here he undergoes a remarkable experience, and feels embarrassed, the only emotion felt in the dream, because he has no stout. This would seem, taken literally, to be totally absurd. The cook, however, does not say that he has to mix beer with stout, but that he must always mix the clear with the muddy. If we glance at the contrast suggested by the words of the cook that occur in the dream, the upper room can be regarded as a contrast with the lower room, not only in the matter of position, but in the matter of inhabitants. Above is the philosophical atmosphere, peculiar to intellect, of a dead world. Below, in the person of the cook, is a very human and very contemporaneous philosopher, who, though not exactly an intellectualist, is far from being a negligible factor in life. The remaining point of interest is found in the sequence of events which follow on the mixing of the beer and the stout. The two rooms become mixed up, merged into one tall room, and curiously enough, neither cook nor philosopher remains. What remains is only vaguely seen. Before continuing the investigation of this dream, a second one may be given, which, though it occurred later, forms a sort of introduction to the above example and helps in the understanding of it. Number 2. So this is number 2 in Roman numerals, so this is apparently the second dream. Quote, I was aiming at a target. It was placed high up. I had a nice rifle, well made, save in one respect. The sights were not properly adjusted. I could only see the bullseye along one sight. Neither of the sights was properly shaped, but seemed lumps of metal clumsily fastened on the barrel. After several attempts, I grew irritable, and I took a chance shot at a bird flying overhead. I hit it, and it fell. It was a very bright-eyed bird, not yet full grown, and I felt sorry. End of quote. The essential plot or theme in this dream seems to lie in the matter of the unadjusted sights. The dreamer can see along only one sight, and both sights are not clearly cut pieces of metal, but lumps clumsily attached to the barrel. A fine fashioning of the sights, which is necessary to accurate shooting, and a fine adjustment of them in proper alignment, constitute the only deficiencies of the rifle. In a way, this might be regarded as a small matter, and one capable of remedy without much expense or difficulty, but at the same time, they render the rifle unsuitable for aiming at a target. Only blind shooting is possible. When the dreamer indulges in this, he brings down a curious kind of bird. If the substance of the dream were to be cast into a single phrase, it might be legitimate to put it in this manner. Quote, "You cannot hit the bullseye of the target because your sights are not finely enough fashioned and they are unadjusted." End quote. If the phrase is compared with the remark of the cook in the previous example, "You must always mix the clear with the muddy," a certain similarity is seen. In the one, an adjustment of the two things is suggested. In the other, a mingling of the two things. The second dream gives no indication of the nature of the two things, but it contains a hint that with the rifle in that condition, only fledglings can be hit, and not a bullseye. The first dream, though, suggesting that the society of old world philosophers impedes the figure of the writing table, deals in a more elaborate manner with the nature of the two things that must be mingled, and it concludes with a dramatic mingling of the clear medium of intellectual theory with the muddier medium of vulgar humanity, which follows on the mixing of the clear beer with the muddy stout. Stout, by the way, is perhaps naturally associated with fat cooks. It must be remembered that the patient was suffering from an inability to achieve a task that he had set for himself and was unable to understand why he failed in so notable a manner. I will now develop I will now develop the anamnesis and reference to the material in the first dream. The patient stated he had attributed in a minor degree his failure to a lack of scholarship and had been rereading the early philosophers, particularly those of ancient Greece and Rome. He did not derive much help from this and was forced to go over the matters several times before it made any lasting impression. Experience may be put in terms of the question of inward appeal, which was touched on in the first chapter. The ancient philosophies made no real appeal to him. They linked up with nothing behind consciousness. They dwelt momentarily in consciousness, unreinforced. Some reading has this effect. lying barren and swiftly withering in consciousness, while other reading acts as a powerful fertilizer and brings up to the surface a multitude of ideas. This, I think, will be granted, that such events must depend on the elements that lie beyond consciousness, in the undersoil of the mind, and belong to the category of inward appeal. The patient, acting on the belief that lack of scholarship was partly behind his ability to make headway with his work, did what he could to focus attention on the philosophical systems of a bygone age. In the dream, in the opening scene, he is depicted as being in a room containing ancient philosophers, that is, a pictorial presentation of his actual situation is given, but a touch of ridicule is suggested by the way they are represented. There is a hint more of the cartoon than of the picture. He is then transported to the lower room, where he has the singular encounter with the cook and receives her cryptic advice. In passing, it may be noted that the dreamer made a spontaneous association between the cook and Socrates. Association suggests, among other things, similarity. There is something in common between the cook and Socrates. In this case, it seems to be the quality of ugliness. That is the superficial link of association. It may contain a deeper significance. Socrates, it must be remembered, was not a mere intellectual theorist dwelling in the upper room. He taught in the streets, in the mud, in the heart of the crowd, in the arena of human experience. A cook of this type depicted approaches life in the Socratic spirit, in that she gains whatever sagacity and wisdom is hers by the process of actual contact with life, and not by theorizing in an upper chamber. Is it legitimate, then, to conclude that some advice of value to the dreamer is contained in these dreams? The patient could not control his interest. He strove to force it in certain directions and failed. There was some internal check, the nature of which was a mystery to him. That force which reveals itself as interest was not vitalizing the elements represented in his consciousness, so that they could produce an adequate effect in reality. It would be possible to say that the force that reveals itself as interest was exhausted, and the patient's condition was comparable to that of an accumulator that has run down and can give only brief and rapid failing current at intervals In that case, we should be reverting to an old-fashioned view and prescribe tonics, rest, the electric battery, massage, and even radium, and think no more about it. It is a view that has something to be said for it. It saves an immense amount of trouble. It saves the physician trouble as well as the patient. But the tendency today is to presume that vital force, like all force, must manifest itself somewhere, though it may change its point of application. A person may be extremely interested in athletics and spend his days enthusiastically in the fields. A change may suddenly occur, and he shuts himself up in his study and reads from morning to night. His interest has shifted. His old companions may say that he has lost all interest and does nothing, but that is surely wrong. The force that reveals itself as interest has gone elsewhere. Its point of application has shifted inwards. it is the same force. But a savage who did not know that writing and reading were possible, while watching him in his new phase, might think his interest had gone, and that he was exhausted as he sat in his chair motionless and absorbed. Before it can be concluded that the patient R's interest was exhausted, an exploration beyond the realm of the immediately obvious must be made, lest unwittingly a point of view is taken up like that of the inexperienced savage. I'm going to pause here, and I'm going to say a few words here because I am reading from a PDF on my laptop, and for some reason the next page of this PDF is missing. So we're missing page 112, and I think this is a good place to pause, and I'll read further next time and see where it kind of comes together and start there. So I think there are about, 6 or 7 pages left in this chapter, but there is a page missing here. So it's page 112, and I hope it doesn't disrupt anything, because I'm really enjoying this chapter. I hope you are too. So till soon.